Right, we will make a start. Many thanks to all of you for attending this first book launch for the faculty's research group and for putting aside hours late on a Friday. Those of you who've been working all week, it's really great that you've decided to come and celebrate Dave and Tegan's book. And for those of you who've traveled a long way, many thanks also. We're here really to listen to Dave talk, but really we're also here to celebrate the 2016. Dave just said, are you sure that's 2016? But yes, in your own book, Dave, it says 2016. A History of Sports Coaching in Britain. That's been written by Dave and Tegan. And Dave and I started at MMU at the same time, far too many years ago. And for 15 of those years, so it tells you how long it was, the coaching, sociology, sports history, work that didn't measure something was never really supported in the exercise and sports science department because of a number of reasons, but particularly the development of the research culture at that time. And all this latent talent, this latent research talent, only came out in about 2006, 2008, when we recognized that Bill, Ryan, and Dave, and many others were researchers and needed to be supported in a way that the department hadn't done before. And over the past 8 to 10 years or so, that research group, led by Bill and Dave and others in this room, have been as prolific, and in some cases more prolific, than some of our natural science researchers. And we've seen them grow to the extent that they've now been returned at international excellent and world-leading status within the REF. And it's just going on and on. PhD completions on time, outputs coming from PhD students, grant awards, Ryan and Bill winning many grant awards. All the things that could have happened many years before if the vision of the research groups had just seen that. So that's something which I'm particularly proud of, that team have begun to emerge and hold their own within not only the department, not only the faculty, but also within the university, and increasingly, as I'm seeing, within international standings for particularly sports history, as we're seeing tonight. So Dave's become one of the most prolific researchers within the university, let alone within our exercise and sports science department. And this is Dave's 6th book, and I went on to our new software package that allowed me to check what he's been doing over the last few years. And this book takes him into the 55s area. So he has over 55 formal academic publications. In the old days, that would have allowed him to apply for a chair. So just drop that in. We're being recorded, aren't we? Anyway. But I think as important as Dave's profile is the pride that I've got in seeing this book being published with one of Dave's first PhD students. Part of being a researcher is that you do have that pride of working with better people than yourselves who have that real passion and drive to take things forward. And certainly it's probably one of the reasons that I try and carry on doing research as much as I can. And Tegan was one of our first IPR, Institute for Performance Research, funded students. Even better than that, she was nominated and had a reference from one of our students from many years ago, Dave Shearer, who again came through the BTEC route, BSc, Master's, PhD route, and then taught Tegan at Swansea. And that journey, that we can follow, that route that they've taken is probably the most important part of this for me. Is that to publish something of this quality with your PhD student is really special. And Les Berwitz was one of the people that you were interviewed, and he was one of my mentors, and he would be particularly proud, I think, to see that collaboration, that ongoing work between the supervisor and the student, particularly in this area of the humanities, where typically you write work on your own. And I know other colleagues around this institution and other institutions are recognizing that maybe you should increasingly look to co-author work from your PhDs And Alison and I were with Bertold this morning, and he was saying exactly that they've got to think differently. Humanities and arts have got to look to start collaborating more like we do in the sciences, because there's a lot of work that maybe isn't getting published that could be through just that extra nurturing through the academic teams. So it's really pleasing to see that Tegan's been part of that journey. Today wouldn't have happened without lots of help and support from a number of people, but I'm particularly indebted to 3 people that are sat on the front row there. 2 of them with some bubbles in front of them. That's good. Well done. You deserve it. But before we start the formal thing today, I'd certainly like to thank on your behalf all of the work that Maddie's done, supported by Claire, and with some very clear guidance and drive and enthusiasm from Margaret. So many, many thanks to the 3 of you for making this happen. When I imagined what we would do today, it looked exactly like this, with this kind of audience. So really well done. Thank you very much. And well done, Margaret, for continuing to push to make it happen too. Because I'm sure Dave at some point said, well, we don't need to bluff and bluster and bish bash bosh, we're not doing that. But it's a good thing to do. We have to celebrate our successes. And this was just to show that somebody had read your work. And I found this in the book because for me it summed it up probably as much as any section of the book that I could find. I was looking for some stats and some data, of course, but wasn't much of that in there. But I really liked that quotation. And it is from Day and Carpenter, 2016, and I'll pass over to the lead author. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much. Okay, if you are tweeting, can you please use this hashtag so that we can develop a story file off it at some point in the future. Those of you who've seen me present before know that if I go off script, this could double in length, so I don't intend to go off script, and I'll stick fairly closely to the points that I want to make. So, thank you, Paul, and thank you for everyone for taking your time out to attend this session, and especially to my co-author, Tegan Carpenter, a model postgrad student who dealt brilliantly with the demands of a PhD. My thanks also to all the SpLeisH research team and to colleagues from Cheshire Research, led by Paul, and to the Department of Exercise and Sports Science colleagues, especially Neil Fowler, for their ongoing support. As a sports historian working in a sports science department, I have sometimes been met with an amused tolerance, references to dusty archives, but I've always been encouraged in my work, even when I challenge the assumption that science is the be-all of the known world. In deciding what to talk about today, I took into consideration the potential diversity of the audience and the need to relate the content of our book, which focuses on historical coaching developments in athletics and swimming. So with Crewe about to open a new swimming pool, swimming seemed a particularly suitable topic, especially as I'm currently compiling a biography of Harry Koskie, a local swimming coach who has been hidden from our sporting history for too long. I also wanted to take into account the spatial and intellectual setting in which we find ourselves. Although MMU became a university in 1992, after being established as a polytechnic in 1970, its roots go much further back into its development as a centre of technology, art and design from the Manchester Mechanics Institute and the Manchester School of Design, which you can see at the top there. Subsequent editions included colleges of education at Alsager and at Crewe. The roots of our institution then are firmly situated in the craft and practical training that have typified the educative process for centuries. Similarly, those of us who work at MMU Cheshire operate within a commercial and industrial landscape that has always valued the notion of learning on the job, be that in the potteries or on the Crewe railways. What is true for industry is also true for sports coaching. And the coaches I discuss here all learnt their trade through direct engagement with the craft of coaching. As a result, they became innovators of practices, skills and processes that have stood the test of time. My talk today then will try to draw together some of these threads within the context of a chronological biographical narrative of three coaches, which I hope will demonstrate my central argument that coaching has always been a craft, in the sense that that term is used in industry, and that this fundamental truth has largely been forgotten. Hence the title of my talk, which draws somewhat tenuously on Peter, Paul and Mary's 1962 lament. For those of you who are too young to know the song, listen, it's great. Human beings like stories, and we have long traditions in telling them, but the key thing for the historian is that an interpretation is placed on those stories that puts them into context. The basic structure of this presentation then is a short theoretical background followed by three coaching biographies and winding up with some thoughts about what those lives tell us about experience, learning by doing and the longevity of craft coaching, as well as the critical importance of the individual to the progress of coaching, and indeed society more generally. My contention is that these factors remain much more important than certification and centralised explicit knowledge. This is not presented as a polemic and might seem a strange position for someone instrumental in introducing coaching degree programs to MMU, but I guess it's a function of age in that I've had time to reflect on those initiatives and the direction that process has taken in recent years. We start with a brief consideration of the theoretical context. Students attending Crewe College after 1945 would have been introduced to the educational philosophy of John Dewey, just as I was when I undertook teacher training in the late 1960s. I recently became reacquainted with Dewey when colleague Ryan Groom asked me to contribute to his edited collection on learning in sports coaching, which is coming out next year, that is in 2016. And I was struck by how much my writing on the history of sports coaching resonated with Dewey's basic concepts. In rejecting Hegel's view that progress occurs on a grand scale, Dewey argued that progress tended to be piecemeal, resulting from individuals and groups consciously reconstructing their environment. And his philosophy of experimentalism was the notion that learning occurs through problem solving. And it was grounded in the belief that people learn from experiences and then reflecting on those experiences. This philosophy has relevance here because coaching situations are so fluid that coaches are forced to think creatively in order to establish a degree of control over their shifting environments. During that process, they rely on their experiences and the ideas developed through those engagements to coach effectively. If this is true, and I think it probably is, then coaching programs based on the principle of learning through doing are critical. In enabling coaches to think creatively, they need to be exposed to a range of experiences because the skills developed through that process are fundamental to the notion of knowledge and provide tools for further discovery and learning. Coach learning at all levels, then, is a continuing reconstruction of experience, the rethinking and re-examining of concepts and experiences in order to deal with the demands of the present. And in that respect, coaches must be active participants in their learning, operating in a cyclical, transactional manner with their sporting environments. Now, these ideas should be borne in mind as I illustrate the coaching process of the last 2 centuries through the lives of practitioners who span successive generations, starting with Professor, not an academic title, but one that emphasises expertise, Fred Beckwith. Beckwith's longevity and his impact on the development of swimming make him a perfect individual with which to start our story. Having beaten all the cracks in southern England by 1840, Beckwith, a fancy willow seat maker, relocated to London, which was an astute decision for anyone intent on selling their sporting or entertainment skills to the public. The Lambeth Baths, with which Beckwith had a long association as swimming master, were the most extensive in England, and his position enabled Beckwith to exploit its commercial possibilities. By 1859, he was calling himself a professor, having consolidated his status by winning the Championship of England. He also taught at several prestigious schools, through which he established extensive connections to the nobility, and he formed a National Philanthropic Swimming Society to promote swimming among the working classes. His coaching career began during this period when he worked with Gardner, the 500 yards champion of England. Fred's career as a swimming coach and entrepreneur highlights the role of what Gramsci called the organic intellectual in stimulating and sustaining interest. His swimming knowledge, social networks and entrepreneurial flair, together with his control of essential facilities, established him at the centre of an extensive sporting and entertainment community and consolidated his reputation as a leading swimming professor of his age. Over his lifetime, his core community contained his children, Jessie and Frederick, then Willie, Charles and Agnes, and finally Lizzie and Robert. With other family members such as second wife Elizabeth, daughter-in-law Emma, son-in-law William Taylor, and grandchildren Frederick and Aggie. Thanks to his father's coaching, Willie won a number of championships during the 1870s and 80s, while Agnes had a lifetime's association with swimming. And to cater for the demand for lessons generated by her aquatic performances, Fred expanded his teaching classes for women and provided costumes for sale or hire. In 1882, Agnes married William Taylor, an integral part of the Beckwith community, who managed the family during engagements at both home and abroad. Among the non-familial members of Beckwith's community were professionals like Thomas Atwood, who could be seen exhibiting with the Beckwith frogs in a plate glass tank in the 1860s before going on to become a professor. He's demonstrating smoking underwater there. David Pamplin first exhibited with Beckwith in 1858 and subsequently had a lifetime's involvement in swimming. The careers of these men were built upon the understanding of swimming they gained while interacting with Beckwith and are a good illustration of the way that knowledge was transferred and sustained within coaching communities. Now, while Victorian craft coaching involved specialist knowledge being conveyed through family or significant others, knowledge exchange also occurred elsewhere. Music halls and inns provided a focus for popular culture and often became centres of local sporting networks. Beckwith used the symbolic capital associated with his status as champion to attempt a number of commercial ventures, emphasising his entrepreneurship, another feature common to elite coaches of all periods. From 1859 he ran a beer shop, and in 1861 he took over a pub, the Good Intent, which became an important centre for the dissemination of sporting information. He was later involved in another beer shop, a post office stores and a hotel. Business directories of the period listed him variously as a swimming teacher, an agent for aquatic galas and a tobacconist, while he also ran a betting booth at Epsom Racecourse. Over time, the Beckwith appearances became more theatrical. Fred took full advantage of the whale tank facility at the Royal Aquarium in Westminster, where his troupe appeared throughout the 1880s, demonstrating swimming strokes and life-saving, alongside feats such as eating sponge cakes underwater. To attract paying customers, Fred recruited more female swimmers, and during the 1890s, family members and their connections appeared in aquatic entertainments, in music halls, circus rings, aquaria, and swimming baths around the country. Now, academic assessments of Beckwith, and there's been a couple, have concluded that his success was due to his capacity for self-publicity, and have been critical of his use of what were, for his time, normal professional practices. Nietzsche was scathing about those who write history in the belief that justice resides in the popular view of their time, and critics failed to appreciate the impact that this man made. What is more relevant is the testimony of those who actually knew him. Webb considered Beckwith the best judge of swimming living, and both Wilson and Thomas described Beckwith as the father of present-day swimming. Swimming cultures of the late 19th century then were characterised by tightly connected communities of practice centred on men like Beckwith, who had multiple roles as trainers, technicians, managers, publicity agents and entrepreneurs. Fred had responsibility not only for the performance of his athletes, but also for the progress of the sport, since he depended on both of those for economic gain and status. His activities spanned a broad cultural range, while his intimate circle contained his family and others who were drawn into his orbit, and many of whom went on to develop the sport further. Using the tried and tested methods of the professor, but including their own approaches and innovation. So as a result, through his coaching and teaching, his demonstrations and exhibitions, his exploitation of the potential of female swimmers, and his entrepreneurial skills, Beckwith was as responsible for the expansion of 19th century swimming as any individual or organisation. Just highlighting the importance of the individual. In some respects, Beckwith was the last of his kind. As the ASA imposed its amateur vision, it left no place for the aquatic entrepreneurs, who disappeared along with the music halls to which they were ultimately consigned. However, there was considerable leakage around the margins of amateur hegemony, especially with respect to artisan coaches. As E.P. Thompson argued in The Making of the English Working Class, an artisan's position often survived because a craft, like professional coaching, remained highly skilled and specialised. An established tradition of tolerance for these educated craftsmen was subsequently extended to include some professional coaches, such as Walter Brickett. Brickett was born in 1865 and followed in the footsteps of his brothers as a pianoforte maker, although during the early 1900s he began to be referred to as professor. Between 1883 and 1898, Walter competed regularly in amateur swimming and athletic events. He was also involved in creating the Life Saving Society, along with leading amateurs William Henry and Archibald Sinclair, and this was crucial to his future acceptance by the Amateur Swimming Association. He became a prominent coach, and by 1907 he was coaching 25 swimming clubs. He also trained channel swimmers, including Jabez Wolfe, who made, and this must have been sad for him, 22 attempts and never succeeded. Walter covered Wolfe all over with a special preparation. That's the costumes only for the camera. They swam without costumes on. And fed him every half hour with chicken sandwiches, biscuits, OXO, chocolate, chicken broth, wheat tea and cocoa. The important thing is that Wolfe went on to coach several successful swimmers, and he wrote instructional books in which he recorded his appreciation of Brickett. In 1908, Brickett was appointed trainer to the Olympic team. I think you can see which one he is in those photographs. And he was appointed again as trainer and advisor-in-chief in 1912. Walter was something of an expert on the front crawl and travelled around the country teaching the stroke. His successes included Harold Annison, who won the ASA 100 yards title using the crawl, and again, then went on to become a respected amateur coach. Professional coaches like Brickett invariably advocated the crawl for competition, although the ASA insisted on retaining the outdated trudgeon stroke in its teacher certification and in educational material. Traditional developments were being discouraged by amateur traditionalism, something of a paradox given the widespread perception of craft conservatism as holding back innovation. Beckwith and his contemporaries had always established a reputation as a champion before converting this capital into the status of a swimming professor. Walter undertook a number of multi-event challenges in order to establish himself in the same way. In 1919, aged 54, he walked a mile, ran a mile over hurdles, cycled 3 miles, rowed a mile, swam a mile, all inside 55 minutes, 34 1/5 seconds. The value to his coaching career of these physical achievements was reflected in his adverts, which noted that he was the holder of a world's athletic record, not that anybody else has ever tried it, and a British Olympic swimming trainer. In 1932, Walter, then still actively coaching, was forced to retire through ill health, and he died a year later. His sons, Sidney and Reg, went on to become founder members of the National Association of Swimming Instructors, while daughter Dolly was involved in teaching. Reg became president of the Swimming Teachers Association of Great Britain, and a 1969 report described him as an international swimming coach and inventor of Brickett's Swim Easy arm floats. Now, although his activities overlapped spatially and temporally with those of Beckwith, Brickett encountered a different environment to that faced by his predecessor, one that was characterised by centralised control and an adherence to amateur values. However, as his biography demonstrates, professional coaches continued to utilise a traditional methodology based on oral traditions and personal experience, an inability to innovate and apply entrepreneurial skills, and the transmission of a body of craft knowledge within communities of practice. When swimmers became coaches, they sustained and improved traditional practice, drawing on the knowledge and social networks developed while in training. The coaching legacy that Walter left through his children and through athletes like Jabez Wolfe and Harold Annison mirrors closely the traditional features of Beckwith's coaching community. In contrast to Beckwith and Brickett, Leon Henry Koskie, Harry, was an amateur coach, not a professor. While his coaching career overlapped with that of Brickett, and he was just as rigorous in his approach as any of his professional predecessors, Mr. Koskie, a phraseology that emphasised his amateur status, had a different relationship with the sport and with the ASA. Unlike Beckwith and Brickett, he was very much an insider. I would like at this point to extend my thanks to Paul Newman and to his family for their willingness to share their archives, and I look forward to a long and fruitful association in uncovering Koskie's life and that of Norman Wainwright. Koskie's working life was spent in management of Blythe Colourworks in Staffordshire, a successful company in the post-war period that produced enamels, glazes and colours for household goods. The 1948 and 1951 AGMs recorded that Koskie was re-elected as a director on both occasions, and his business position allowed Harry to amass an estate worth over £400,000 by his death. The cooperation of Mike Plant is much appreciated in finding these photos of Harry from the company archives. Harry officiated for Britain at 5 Olympic Games and managed British teams at Empire Games and European Championships. He served on the Northern Counties Committee, was twice president of Staffordshire ASA and became president of the ASA in 1962, making him somewhat ironically the leading figure in an organisation that had previously marginalised coaches like Beckwith and Brickett. However, this was a different era, and Koskie was not cut from the same cloth as many other ASA officials. He had experienced the elite swimming world firsthand and brought a wealth of coaching knowledge to the role. I will illustrate this by outlining briefly two aspects of his coaching: his work with Norman Wainwright and the way he approached the task of making British swimmers competitive at the Olympics. Harry began his coaching career while still participating as a member of a Hanley swimming team that included Norman Wainwright. Observers in the 1930s were enthusiastic about Norman's potential and complimentary about Koskie's contribution to his development. The Daily Mail noted in 1935 that Norman was Britain's main hope for Berlin, although in the end he failed to make an individual final. Norman had improved his physique with gymnastic exercises, while Koskie had perfected his swimming technique and looked after his preparation. When Wainwright won the 220 and 440 yards titles in record time at Wembley in July 1936, it was noted that he had injured his ankle so severely 5 weeks previously that Harry had accelerated his rehabilitation by renting a cottage close to an open-air bath at Hanley and arranging 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. training sessions every day. This was typical of Koskie's dedication to his coaching. After Norman performed poorly in the heats of the 1938 ASA Championships, Harry drove 200 miles to be with his swimmer, who then broke his British record in winning the 220 yards freestyle. Koskie's detail was reflected in his work with Norman in the 1939 season. In the mile championship, prepared by Harry, Wainwright in 10 minutes 51 seconds, took only 4 seconds longer for the second half mile, even pace swimming as we would call it today. Observers noted that on Koskie's advice he was now using an improved leg movement. The 6-beat crawl action was apparently automatic and tireless, with a somewhat slower arm stroke synchronised with a relatively deeper leg kick. Norman subsequently broke the British record for 1,000 yards by swimming for an extra 120 yards after winning the Northern Counties half-mile event. He kept to a schedule prepared by Koskie, devised specifically to break the record, eventually finishing just inside the target time. As a journalist noted, just as Weissmuller had had absolute and unquestionable faith in his coach, Norman relied on the judgment and racing time schedule of Mr. L.H. Koskie. By the mid-1940s, Harry was among the leading amateur coaches in Britain, and in August 1946, he accepted the offer of the ASA to act as chief advisor for the 1948 Olympics. The position was described as an honorary one, emphasising his amateur status. Shortly after his appointment, Koskie addressed the Olympic hopefuls, drawing on his significant coaching and training knowledge to outline the dangers of overtraining. He further noted that swimmers who wish to attain the highest honours should be prepared to accept reasonable guidance, signalling to everyone that he intended to directly supervise their training. Koskie also immediately pushed for the acceptance of the butterfly arm stroke in breaststroke events. This is before there was a separate breaststroke event, butterfly event, and people were using the butterfly arms in breaststroke events. Since he knew that although it had not been allowed in Britain, it was in widespread use elsewhere. The ASA legalised the technique in March 1947, much to Koskie's relief, and he began to persuade breaststroke swimmers to practice the butterfly stroke, even though he knew this would upset some traditionalists. Talent spotting was a critical part of the advisor's role, and the identification of suitable Olympians was left to Koskie, who used his coach's eye rather than scientific measurements or physiological testing, to make his selection. And he spent the 2 years following his appointment conferring with swimmers and coaches all over Britain. The first special course held at Loughborough College in August 1947 witnessed the participation of 47 swimmers and 7 coaches, all recommended by Koskie. The programme received good publicity thanks to his initiative in inviting the BBC. Pool time was limited, but water fitness was not his main objective, and he prioritised the building of team spirit. The 1948 Loughborough School marked the final part of Koskie's 2-year plan to prepare for the 1948 Games. This course, under Koskie's direction, incorporated medical monitoring and physiotherapy under Koskie's direction, and helped identify potential Olympians, many of whom Koskie had been nurturing for some time. For example, he'd helped Jack Hale by working alongside Hale's coach to select his most appropriate events following a series of time trials. Central to Koskie's hopes was Cathy Gibson, seen in the middle there. And even when she failed to find a form at the 1948 ASA Championships, Koskie, who had been giving her special training for 3 weeks, remained optimistic. Now, Koskie was faced with a number of problems at the Games, not least the placing of the national championships only 19 days before the Games, making it difficult for Olympians to hold peak condition. He instructed them to keep out of the water for a week in order to rest, and then they reported for training at Loughborough before moving on to their London headquarters 2 days before the Games. Koskie had required everyone to keep a complete record of their daily swims and times in a special logbook. And he summed up his plans for final training by saying that some will be eased, some will be squeezed. Guided by these charts and logbooks showing performance over many months, he decided who needed only light training and who needed something more serious. Although Wembley Pool was available for practice for a fortnight before the Games, Koskie thought it psychologically better for his team to spend most of this time away from the pre-Olympic excitement. Unfortunately, arrangements at the Games prevented Koskie's initiatives from achieving their full potential. He was particularly upset by the separation of the sexes by 17 miles, which affected the team spirit that he had established. The female swimmers had also been billeted on the 8th floor of a building without a lift, while the male swimmers had faced difficulty in organising training. Arrangements had been made to use the privately owned Uxbridge pool, but the pool refused to close to the public and it was swamped with bathers. Koskie considered these arrangements had taken the edge off the whole team, and in the end, although numerous British swimmers reached finals, Gibson won Britain's sole swimming medal at the Games, a bronze in the 400 metres freestyle. Nevertheless, commentators considered that Uncle Harry, as he was known among the swimmers, had done much to raise standards, partly by fostering the best team spirit in British sport. However, recognising that world beaters cannot be developed in a few months, Harry made a number of suggestions for the future. The Loughborough Summer School should become an annual event, and a top-class American coach should be invited to attend. ASA districts should bring together their most promising young swimmers to train under one chief coach, something that is now common practice, and Koskie made recommendations about the spotting of promising young swimmers. Now, Harry had been appointed on the premise that he planned for 1952 and for 1956, as well as preparing swimmers for the 48 Games. His planning for the Loughborough Swim School consisted of 3 phases over a period of 10 years, and the 1956 course saw the culmination of his drive for the introduction of new methods of training and coaching, all of which was justified when Judy Grinham achieved the first British swimming gold medal for 32 years in Melbourne. While Koskie was an amateur coach, he clearly shared many of the working methods of his professional predecessors. His coaching practices certainly relied on his own experiences as an athlete and embryonic coach, as well as the broader traditions of the wider coaching community. This community included coaches both at home and abroad, and his involvement in working with international teams brought him into contact with a wider sphere of influence than either Beckwith or Brickett. Koskie also connected with the professional coaching community through individuals such as Professor Jack Laverty of Manchester, who ran coaching clinics at Hanley organised by Koskie. Laverty had a considerable reputation, and Wainwright paid tribute to his valuable advice. The transfer of knowledge continued to rely on oral transmission, and coaches like Koskie drew on their experiences and their reflections on those experiences to devise training schedules, prepare competition plans, and identify potential talent without the input of sports scientists. In their day, these elite coaches were the sports scientists. So, nice stories, but so what? Okay? Well, using biographies in this way can help illustrate continuity over the course of generations, as well as demonstrating the way that individuals respond to the changing demands of their social, political, and economic environments. Accounts of coaching experience, located and understood in context, also allow the chronicler to identify the working methods common to expert coaches. The practices of these swimming coaches, for example, highlight the centrality of oral traditions, tacit knowledge, community, experience, and intuition in establishing coaching expertise. These coaches operated within informal groups, communities of practice, and learned how to coach effectively by sharing experiences, stories, and solutions, all of which contributed to their toolbox of craft knowledge. Learning occurred in a horizontal and mainly non-cognitive fashion, in contrast to the vertical transmission implied in teacher-pupil and mentoring relationships. Skills and knowledge were reproduced across generations, not through instruction, but through the granting of access to shared understandings. These working practices resonate with the traditional processes observed in industrial craft communities. The conventional craftsman was the master of a body of knowledge and skills, the transmission of which involved the master modelling and the apprentice continually observing, a process described as stealing with the eyes. Similarly, the coach was the master of a body of knowledge garnered through organisational socialisation, whereby aspiring coaches acquired knowledge and skills, as well as absorbing the nuances of coaching practice by interacting with expert practitioners. Athletes subsequently entered coaching already provided with comprehensive maps of meaning from their experiences. In this respect, coaching can be considered a craft. And this remains the nature of coaching for me, 2,000 years after the Greeks referred to the coach as the tekton, the carpenter or builder of the athlete. It has been argued that this inhibited innovation, since apprentices are generally taught only to copy, but craftsmen have also been constantly stimulated to experiment by competitors, commercialisation, and emerging technologies. No one can be entirely exempt from contemporary influences, and coaches experimented in applying emerging knowledge, intuitively accepting or rejecting appropriate material, thereby adding something to the training process, particularly in periods of educational, commercial, and scientific advance. Coaches who learnt their trade actively, as these three men did, rather than as a passive recipient of an instructional process, built a deeper understanding of the world in which they used their skills, and through the continual development and use of those skills, they experienced learning as a lifelong process. As the 20th century progressed, these traditional craft approaches came under pressure from the increasing internationalisation of sport and the emergence of the Olympic Games as a mega sporting contest. In the 1950s, the Soviet model of sport, based on systematic coaching using the latest scientific evidence, emerged as an increasingly effective means of achieving international success. In addition, the American college model, based on the central role of the professional coach, which had been dominant since the beginning of the century, became more scientifically orientated, especially in university physical education departments, where they began to assimilate emergent sciences such as sports psychology. The domination of these two power blocks at the Olympics persuaded other nations, including Britain, to imitate their methods, and sports science rapidly assumed a central role in athletic preparation around the world. Not that this was adopted uncritically by British elite coaches, who recognised that policy borrowing, the carte blanche adoption of foreign systems, was flawed. Athletics coach Frank Dick, for example, argued that what was happening in Eastern Europe was that the coaches were asking questions so that the scientists could get solutions to their problems. Whereas what was happening in the West was that the scientists were pushing answers to questions that had never been asked to the coaches who didn't want to hear the science. These dissenting voices were lost, however, in the latter stages of the 20th century, as increasing government intervention in elite sports, the creation of government quangos, and the introduction of national lottery funding for national governing bodies created a fertile environment for sports science practitioners, intent on establishing and protecting their own position in the sporting hierarchy. Cleverly, these academics have consolidated their position as credentialism and professionalisation have become the driving force behind coach development, to the point where some of them now regard themselves as almost more important than the coaches. The biographies presented here, however, suggest that elite coaches have always found their own path through the tensions between craft and science, searching out and using science in the light of their own experiences and reflections, rather than having it imposed upon them. The current drive for standardisation through professionalisation and the centrality of formal certification, which prejudices explicit scientific knowledge over intangibles such as experience and intuition, goes not only against this history, but also many 21st century studies into coaching that reinforce Dewey's emphasis on the centrality of experience and reflection. Recent research has confirmed his view of expertise as a fluid, cyclical process, with coaches continuously redeveloping their competencies in order to operate in ever-changing environments. And other coaches, contemporary coaches, consistently identify experimentation, their own experiences, and other coaches as their most important resources. As a result, attempts are now being made to replicate many aspects of craft coaching by introducing rationalised alternatives, such as communities of practice or coaching mentors, but these are being structured from above rather than emerging organically from below. Although some observers argue that coaches can no longer rely solely on learning the trade through experience, I'm not so sure that that's the case. If experiential learning is critical, and the examples of Beckwith, Brickett and Koskie suggest that it is, perhaps it is time for a proper apprenticeship programme based on the notion of craft, coaching as a craft, not as a science. This has been recognised as a viable way forward in business and industry, so perhaps it's time for coaching to take a step back and consider its possibilities. My final point today in the so what category relates to the use of biography as a method for exploring coaching, and indeed the past in its widest sense. Bourdieu described biographies as illusions, arguing that lived lives were chaos. But these swimming coaches' life courses illustrate not only the continuity in craft practices across generations, but also emphasise the impact that the individual makes in influencing the course of history. That applies to every one of us in this room. I can do no better than finish with a quote from sociologist C.W. Mills. Every individual lives from one generation to the next in some society. He lives out a biography within some historical sequence. By the fact of his living, he contributes, however minutely, to the shaping of his society and to the course of its history, even as he is made by society and by its historical push and shove. Thank you.